Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk, and we were joking just before we started recording that there's one or two things going on in Washington D.C. right now that are worth talking about. And are we going to have enough to fill our entire half hour with our guest, Senator Kevin Cramer? Of course, joining me on Fridays, my co-host Chad Oban, which I'm getting better at, Chad, about introducing the co-host because I get so excited. I have the guest on, I have the co-host. I just launch right into the questions, and I forget to tell the people who are listening just who it is they're listening to. So I'm getting better at that.
I think that they just know. I think if they're
know?
here, they're for the co-host, and so they just know I'm here.
They just know you. They could just sense the Oban bump preemptively. Yeah, okay.
You said it first, man. You said it first.
It's undeniable at this point. Senator Cramer, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. I'm in North Dakota, which is always better than being in Washington, but anxious to get back to work because there's lots of things to do, even if the House, is dysfunctional.
Well, that was my first question. How much can the United States Senate do right now, given that the House can't do anything? Because they don't have a speaker. It sounded like we might have a speaker, Representative Steve Scalise, so I know you're a good friends with. He didn't make the cut, so. At this point, it's a question mark.
He did get the most votes. Well, he did get the most votes, however, ironically.
But he didn't. But he didn't get it. He didn't get it done on the floor. So, right. What can the Senate do? I mean, is there a fear about you guys getting too far ahead of the House? I mean, that's got to be a very strange situation for you.
Well, it's particularly strange, Rob, when you consider that the real crisis in front of us is appropriations, because we are now in a continuing resolution well beyond the September 30th end of the fiscal year, and the next fiscal cliff coming up November 17th, when you consider that all appropriations have to begin in the House. So that's literally a process complication. However, we do have one appropriations bill that the House passed on the floor and sent over to us, which fulfills the obligation of getting an appropriations bill from the House that we then can turn into a larger appropriations bill. And right now, that one appropriation from the House is a 3 appropriation bundle, if you will. Remembering there are 12 in total. And so the one that came over from the House, I think the one that came over from the House was Military Construction Veterans Affairs, which is oftentimes the first one. It is now a military construction, VA, agriculture, and transportation bills. So 3 of the 12 we've put into what we call a minibus. We often hear the term omnibus, which is all 12 of them in one big package at the end of the year, and it's disgusting. Minibus is not full functionality with 12 separate bills, but it's a lot better than an omnibus. So we actually have that bill. We're actually, quote, on it now. What that means is we've filed cloture, we passed cloture, we're on the bill. Now the only thing that remains is to negotiate how many and which amendments will be allowed to be voted on. The last look, there were 25 of them, 20 of them Republican amendments, 5 Democratic amendments. So when we get back Monday, we'll hopefully start out, hitting that appropriations bill.
So, Senator, before the last CR was passed, and obviously people remember that the way that got done in the House cost Kevin McCarthy his speakership, because he wanted to keep the government open, and I think he deserves some kudos for that. Yep. There was very little optimism on either side of the Hill that something was going to actually get done. I think it was sort of conventional wisdom that there was going to be a shutdown. So 35 days until the next deadline. How are people feeling right now? Obviously the House needs to get their stuff together, but do you think there's a chance that you use that minibus to create something that will keep the government open moving forward after those 35 days?
Well, great point, Chad, because 35 is not very many days, obviously, although we do work best under a deadline.
Yep.
That said, let's just pretend for a minute that the House eventually does get a speaker, here fairly shortly, and we can at least get one or two of these minibuses done. The House has done a couple of other appropriations bills, in the meantime, and so we probably have the vehicles we need. And it should be noted too that the Senate Appropriations Committee passed all 12 appropriations bills as the House did. So it's not like hasn't been any progress. There's actually been considerable progress compared to previous years recently. So that said, to answer your question, my sense is that the most optimistic outcome would be if we were to get 6 or 9 even of the 12 appropriations done by November 17th, which would mean we'd probably still have to have a temporary partial continuing resolution, but at least we'd have two things: some of the work done and some momentum to get it done. But Chad, I don't mind telling you that's a very optimistic outcome, because as of now, the House, certain factions of the House don't seem to be even interested in functionality. They almost seem to be interested in the government shutdown more than they are in functionality. And that's a pretty significant problem.
So, and it's not just, obviously keeping our government open, which is central to Congress's job, but since this drama with the speaker has begun to unfold, we have something happening over in Israel right now, where the United States, obviously it was unexpected. This wasn't something we could have possibly budgeted for or anything. So we need some action. I think there's some things that the president can certainly do in the interim, but ultimately the president can't act in a lot of very significant ways without Congress. So, what, if anything, can Congress do until there's a speaker to help our friends, or to assure our friends in Israel that we're behind them and we're behind them and certainly more than just words?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because but Israel is the one sort of exception to some of this, in that we actually have legislation. I think it's called the Israeli Defense Act, which is part of the National Defense Authorization Act that we're living under right now. It passed a couple of years ago, where it's, I want to say, $3.5 billion, or it's a significant amount of money anyway. And then we also have ongoing U.S.-Israeli weapons systems that we've either created together. Missile defense in particular is a key one. We often hear about Iron Dome, which is a Israeli technology that the United States has helped to build and fund. So we have sort of a continuing financial and military weapon systems relationship with Israel that we didn't have, for example, with Ukraine. So we don't have to dig into stockpiles and those kinds of things. Now, that's not, that may not meet the demand at any given time, but we're also, in the case of Israel, talking about a country that's very well prepared. It's a country that has a very sophisticated military, a very committed military, and commits a very large portion of their budget to national defense for all the obvious reasons that they're surrounded by enemies. And so it's not quite as crucial, but Rob, to the broader point, though, it is crucial in this sense that, I believe we have a very weak president who's projected weakness to Iran and to Russia, and it is the cause for this emboldened opposition to freedom around the world. And so I don't have any trouble laying a lot of blame on this president for his weakness. At the same time, a dysfunctional Congress doesn't exactly project a lot of confidence either. And that's why I think for House members to be behaving the way they're behaving, they act as though the institution exists for them, as opposed to them being less than 0.25% of the institution, and using their individual, really what amounts to power because of the narrow divide between the House and Republicans and House Democrats. It really is contributing in their chaos, they're contributing to the lack of confidence that our allies have in us, and adding to the chaos that can be exploited by our adversaries. So it's an all of government issue, this issue of support for Israel.
I don't mean to, I'm going to preempt Chad here, but the follow-up question you kind of touched on a little bit, so I wanted you to expand on it. To what degree are countries like Russia, countries like Iran, I mean, obviously Russia primarily, active in Ukraine, although they have a role to play in what's happening, I think, in Israel as well, and then certainly Iran, how much are they looking at the dysfunction of our Congress right now and seeing an opportunity? I think
quite a bit, Rob. I think quite a bit, because this is a time when we should all be united, not just as Republicans, but as Republicans and Democrats. And there's some outliers on the Democratic side as well, as you know, who are standing, in solidarity with Palestine.
I want to give credit to you and a lot of Democrats too. I mean, for the most part, outside of I think some of the extremes on both sides that you're referring to, I think there has been a lot of people saying a lot of the same things about what's happened in Israel specifically, and Ukraine.
And Ukraine, no question about it. So I think, to your point, though, your question is, yes, I do think leaders look at the combination of things, including a dysfunctional government, really chaos in the house, and they see that as a weakness, because it is a weakness. Our independence as individuals is one of our strengths until it becomes undisciplined, and then it becomes a weakness. And I think we've got to get our act together for sure. So I would agree with you. The thing that's so important, I think, for Americans to realize, and that is that when you pointed to the big ones, Russia, obviously, Iran, China, North Korea, that's sort of the axis of evil, but they are to each other, they're sort of frenemies, but they are more and more forming an alliance around common enemies like the United States. Where we have an advantage is that in Ukraine, for example, we have 50 other countries that are allies with us in Ukraine. And so it's really, really important that we hang on to those relationships, that we demonstrate our solidarity with other freedom-loving countries like Ukraine, obviously like Israel, like South Korea, like Japan, and Australia, and even India, which is one of these, behemoths that has sort of one foot in each camp. What we don't want to do is drive these allied nations into the wrong camp. We need to do a better job of gathering them into our camp. And this dysfunction that I speak of, along with the weakness of a president, I think sends the wrong signals.
So Senator Cramer, sort of staying on that same sort of foreign policy, and Rob sort of alluded to this. I mean, there's been protests around the country on from the Democratic Socialists of America and other groups sort of standing up for the terrorists in Gaza and Israel. But at the same time, the former president, Trump, called Hezbollah very smart, and then took some real shots at the leadership in Israel. In addition to that, we seem to have some fractions within the Republican Party on Ukraine versus Russia. It doesn't feel like we really do have a unified sort of thought process when it comes to supporting our allies like Israel and Ukraine. How do we quiet those voices sort of on the extremes that, I mean, everything I've read about what's happening in Israel in terms of the grotesque acts that are taking place, this is a no-brainer to demonize these people and to condemn them. That's a really broad question, but how do we have a unified voice on these things that seem sort of like we're America, right? This is for us.
Yeah, for sure, Chad. No, great observations all the way around. And the question, the answer is a bigger problem, obviously, than the question. But what I do think we have to do, and we're not talking, when we talk about center right, center left, that's not a small piece of the action. It's really the biggest piece of governing. So in my view, I think we have to isolate the extremes in both parties. And it was my hope that could happen. And then when it happens, it's generally centers around a crisis. I was thinking the other day, go back to the CARES Act, the very first bill we did to support whatever we needed to support, largely not knowing for sure what we needed to support, but we knew we needed to support our economy. and the development of vaccines and those kinds of things. Though that CARES Act, which was the biggest package of all of the post-pandemic packages, passed unanimously in both chambers. You guys, I mean, when I think about that today, that Rand Paul and Mike Lee both voted for that bill, and AOC voted for that bill. I mean, it's so crisis. My point being, crisis oftentimes brings us together. War, even more so. Now, I think the challenge with whether it's Ukraine or Israel maybe not as much, but they're not close enough to home. Whereas like a September 11th issue was home. That too united us. It shouldn't take that. But my biggest concern, Chad, is that throughout history, our attention span gets shorter and shorter and shorter.
Yeah.
I never cease being amazed at how little many Americans, many North Dakotans, how little they know about Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul, and Margaret Thatcher, and how they won the Cold War without firing a shot. I was just up in Grand Forks and Minot for 2 days this week with the acting chief of staff of the United States Air Force, General David Alvin, who used to command up in Grand Forks as about halfway through his career. And so now here he is, the head airman in the United States Air Force, and we're up in Minot looking at all of the ways that we deter our enemies. We need to do a better job. Again, sort of back to answering your question, whether it's one-on-one or in classrooms or on podcasts and talk radio, reminding our citizens that none of this is guaranteed, that none of this great freedom we enjoy is guaranteed, and it can't be sustained without friends and allies. One of the big challenges we have right now, you guys, I think politically, when it comes to support for other countries, is the wide open southern border. 8 million illegal immigrants coming across, and just since Joe Biden has become president, that creates a conflict for a lot of people internally when they say, "Wait a minute, we're more committed to keeping Ukraine's borders than or the West Bank out of Israel or the the Gaza Strip." It's just confusing to people that we're more concerned about those borders than we are about our own border. And we need to use these opportunities, I think, Chad, to say, okay, we're going to take care of this border over here because that's a high priority and we have a political will to do it. But we need to take care of that border too. I think this is the moment when these are the crises that can help us come together. But it still requires level-headed leadership. Again, I mean, you made a great point earlier about Kevin McCarthy lost his speakership over doing exactly what you and I are talking about doing. He did what had to be done when his most extreme factions wouldn't help him do something that they thought they wanted to do.
Well, that extreme faction, I mean, essentially put Speaker McCarthy in a position of having to work with Democrats to keep the government open, and then Democrats turned around and voted with that extreme faction to oust him as speaker. So it's a tough situation. We've been talking a lot about needing to get some of these extreme factions out and get level-headed leadership, and I can't help but ask in that context. Donald Trump is the front runner in the NDGOP, or not the NDGOP, gosh, the GOP.
Probably the NDGOP as well, Rob.
Yep. Yes, okay, but still, we're talking nationally. Was in the GOP. He's the front runner in the GOP field. Maintain that he would be a good leader again. I don't know. I look at him and I see him as the epicenter of a lot of the dysfunction that we're talking about, and I wonder. Given what's going on in Israel and everything, do you really think he'd be a good leader for this country again?
Well, just remember what didn't happen when he was president. Hamas and Iran didn't attack Israel. In fact, Israel normalized relations with.
Yeah, but was that because of Donald Trump, or was that just circumstance?
Oh, that was definitely Donald Trump. I mean, the lead on that was his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, led the Abraham Accords along with Mike Pompeo. It was also partly because Donald Trump had the courage to move the embassy to Israel to Jerusalem and recognize Jerusalem as the legitimate capital of Israel, something that every other president in front of him for the last 4 or 5 said they would do and never did because they didn't have the courage to pull that trigger. he sent Stinger missiles to Ukraine after Barack Obama sent blankets when Russia took Crimea, and while he speaks, I think you raised the issue earlier about him referring to Hezbollah as smart. He's often referred to Xi Jinping as smart and Vladimir Putin as smart. All funny choices of words in my view, but nonetheless, he did that while he also kept them all at bay. He had a strong relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is a critical partner, obviously, in the Middle East, as it relates to lots of things, but most of all, as it relates to Iran as a common enemy. So while not known as the greatest diplomat in the world, he did keep enemies at bay. What
about our internal dysfunction? Maybe is more.
Yeah. So good point, but he also supported Kevin McCarthy for speaker, and tried to keep him as speaker, and frankly spoke out against those that threw him out as speaker. And it seems ironic and maybe even hypocritical in some ways to some people. But Donald Trump, one thing about Donald Trump, while his tactics are often very strange, his outcomes often are good. And you've heard me say many times, I used to say this all the time when he was president to the media in Washington, we take him seriously, but not literally. The problem now is, of course, as time goes on, that's not quite as clever as it was, in his first term as president. So we'll see how we get through all of this. I do worry, frankly, that there's some bad outcomes yet ahead. But I do also think that if Donald Trump becomes president, and if he does, I'll be in his right ear and his left ear, along with a lot of other Republicans, and saying, look, this is not a vengeance tour. This is an opportunity to rebuild and work with colleagues all around to make for a better America, not just for a stronger America, which we certainly want, but we also need a better America.
Senator Cramer, bringing us a little closer to home, you announced this morning $925 million going to the EERC for regional hydrogen hubs. I noticed that was part of the bipartisan infrastructure deal. First, can you talk a little bit about that project, and what would you say to all the people who said you made a mistake by supporting that thing when it's bringing nearly $1 billion into Grand Forks to help with our energy supply?
Yeah, so it's funny you say that, Ted, because when I was looking at some of the information, the last couple of days, the Secretary of Energy and her team, and really for about the last week, we've been in constant communication about this and preparing for the announcement. And I think back on my role as the ranking Republican on the Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee that really crafted the bulk of that bill. The hydrogen hub stuff came from the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. There was some other stuff on broadband that came from the Commerce Committee. But all of these things were committee work, sort of regular order committee work, then put into a package that was led by a gang. One of the things, Chad, that I've noticed over the last year and a half or so since that bill passed, that the criticism for it has waned while the support for it has gained. And except when you get caught by a pilot car somewhere on Highway 14 and it's half hour to the bathroom that you can see 5 miles ahead of you. I'm not saying I've ever experienced that, but but then you might go, what have we done? But that said, all of the things in the infrastructure bill that I just love talking about are a couple of things. One, that it's all paid for. It was literally all paid for with already appropriated funds. Didn't have to borrow any more money or anything to pay for it. But it also it all helps the supply side of our economy. Roads, bridges, even some rail, some pipelines, now hydrogen hubs, things that actually contribute to the supply side. And so clearly, when we come up with things like hydrogen hubs or UAS, the test sites and things like that, it's hard not to think of North Dakota as playing some role in all of that. And given the extraordinary work that the people at the EERC, the Energy and Environmental Research Center, do at the University of North Dakota, combined with a very forward-leaning energy sector here in North Dakota, it was obvious that we should be one of those hubs, and that the hub of the hub would be in Grand Forks at the EERC, just given the assets that we have. So it's the kind of thing, Chad, that could certainly will contribute to saving fossil energy in our state, making it cleaner as well as more productive. I mean, the idea of hydrogen, particularly when we have such a high demand for fertilizer, and we've had shortages of a lot of fertilizer that, or at least supply chains that are broken. So when we're both a demand and can be both the demand and the supply of something as important as all of the products that surround hydrogen, and again, a cleaner energy source, boy, I think it's tailor-made for North Dakota, and North Dakota's tailor-made for it.
Going back to the international front, you have called for reinstitution of there's $6 billion that are sitting in an account, and I know that's become kind of a flashpoint since Hamas's attack on Israel. You have called for that money to be, I guess, impounded basically, or blockaded. I'm not using the right financial terminology at all.
Frozen, I like.
Yeah, there we go. I guess the Biden administration had just, we had just, taken some steps towards, I don't know what you want to call it, normalizing relations with Iran, and then this happens in Israel, and now it feels like we have to backtrack. Talk about that a little bit. What would you like to see happen?
Sure. Yeah, so the $6 billion is a flashpoint. You're right. It's representative of about $60 billion more. But the $6 billion, it was specifically cash that was held in an account, frozen in an account in South Korea, that is Iranian money. And this is something I think sometimes people maybe don't understand. They think that somehow Joe Biden borrowed $6 billion and sent it on a pallet to Iran. It's not. He just freed up this $6 billion. And the reason he did it, you might recall, was part of a prisoner swap. And the prisoner swap itself with terrorists is questionable as far as a geopolitical move goes. But prisoner for prisoner, you might go, well, I don't like, giving the terrorists a terrorist back. Well, they give us some NGO workers, for example. But when that also includes a $6 billion ransom, that's problematic. Now, the good news is that money is now frozen again in a bank in Qatar. So while it got out of South Korea, it's trapped in Qatar. And $6 billion in the Iranian economy is a lot of money. But beyond that $6 billion, since Joe Biden became president, he's released about $60 billion in economic opportunity for Iran. And a lot of it's in the sale of oil, which we had a pretty strong sanctions on, and then other sanctions. What I'm saying today is we need not only keep that $6 billion frozen, which I think we'll be successful in doing, but I've also joined a number of my colleagues in asking Joe Biden to convene the G7 nations and to collectively, as a economic powerhouse. The United States is a pretty good economic powerhouse. About 90% of all international transactions go through the U.S. banking system. So we still have a lot of leverage on our own, but we'd have a lot more if you threw in Italy and Germany and the United Kingdom and Canada and use the entirety of the G7 to leverage our economic might and say, we're going to put sanctions, direct sanctions on Iran and secondary sanctions on Iran. There's primary and then there's secondary. And the secondary sanctions are what speak to the rest of the world and say, not only are we going to sanction Iranian funds and cut them off from the dollar, but we're also going to cut yours off if you do business with them. And we just have to send a stronger signal, a stronger message of might, not just in words, but in actions. And so that's really what I'm talking about. Now, I don't know how far that goes. There's a couple of pieces of legislation right now in the works that I'm on. One of them does keep that $6 billion frozen. Another piece of it, gets to some of these other sanctions. And more than anything, Rob, it asks for the Treasury Department to do a study on the sanctions that are in place and whether they've been enforced, whether they've been adhered to. Because even when Congress passes sanctions, the administration still has an awful lot of authority over, waivers, for example. There's always waivers. How many waivers have been issued and things like that, and that's where we have some disagreement with President Biden. I'd like us to go a little further than just checking out, having the same agency audit itself. I'd like to see some more action than that even. So that's what's at stake. I'd much rather use the peaceful tools of economic pressure than the weapons of war.
Yeah. Well,
Rob, do we have time for one more question here before we cut off?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Again, I'm going to bring us back domestically. Senator, I got a blast text message to me from a guy named Chris from Sam Action.
Yeah.
He said Kevin Cramer is helping Chuck Schumer speed up legalization of pot, even after North Dakota voted against it twice. He even did a deal to allow regulators to keep debanking gun manufacturers to get the pot bill through. Senator Cramer, why are you working so hard to help Democrats?
Yeah.
I suspect I'm not the only one that got this. I pay attention to this stuff, and I don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
What are they talking about?
So what they're talking about is the Safer Banking Act. Now, I've always been a sponsor of the Safe Banking Act, which is the sort of the foundation of safe banking is to recognize, first of all, that states have legalized marijuana in many states, including, by the way, North Dakota. While they have twice voted against it, we have legal marijuana, medicinal marijuana in North Dakota, as do about 37 other states have legalized medicinal marijuana. And of course, as you know, several states have legalized recreational marijuana to varying degrees. And I'm first and foremost a firm believer in federalism. I don't just believe in it. I mean, I believe that our founders created a federalism state here, and we need to recognize states' rights. Now, marijuana is still illegal federally, or is not recognized federally as legal. But we've also never enforced the illegal marijuana laws. We've allowed states to do that. In the process of doing that, we've forced the entire industry to go basically, I'm going to call it underground. That might be a little strong, but it's a cash-only business. So to the people who don't want marijuana legalized, I'm surprised they would be comfortable with it being funded and banked solely as a cash-only business, where literally bags of cash trade hands. Literally, employees have suitcases of cash in their trunk while they go home at night. And the idea that somehow an industry that we dislike, and I've never voted for legalization of marijuana, and I never would. I've always been opposed to it. In fact, I've supported legislation in Congress to prevent it from being legalized. So, but what I do recognize is the safety of a regulated banking regime rather than an unregulated black market regime is a better way to bank this industry. The other thing it does, and the part where the text is really, really wrong, I actually attached amendments to safe banking to make it safer banking that implements some of the things that I've introduced in my Fair Access to Banking Act, and that is to prohibit the banking regulators from making reputational risk depositive. In other words, you know, in the ESG movement, things like firearms industry, fossil fuel industry, private prisons and jails industry, a lot of banks won't fund those things as part of their quote ESG or their conscience, if you will, their reputational risk. We are prohibiting them from doing that in this bill, not green lighting it. They already have it green lit to use reputational risk as a reason to not fund legal commerce, even constitutionally supported legal commerce. I think my amendment, they actually did that.
Yeah, I think safe banking it's a lot bigger than just marijuana, and really, I think at the end of the day, it's about protecting. You know, who is it that makes the laws in this country? Is it going to be these massive corporations that can sort of stand astride commerce? Are they going to decide what we're allowed to do? Or is it the democratic process where we have ballot measures or we have lawmakers and governors and presidents that make the laws for us? I would much rather, as imperfect and flawed as it is, I would rather the people make the laws and the corporations follow the laws rather than the other way around. So,
it's a great, you're right on, Robin and Chad. The funny point about that, when I saw that text message, and I don't mean to chuckle, but I do kind of chuckle, obviously, because what strikes me is, first of all, it's sort of wrong on both points that it tries to make. I mean, it's completely wrong on both points it tries to make. And SAM is an organization who says their goal is to have responsible marijuana laws and really prevent the legalization of marijuana, except marijuana is legal in what, 2/3 of the states of our country. So then the question becomes, do you want it to be a regulated industry, or do you want it to be a black market industry? And then second of all, let's protect other industries that are out of favor with the American public or the American left. And so they're really wrong on both fronts. But the thing that struck me ironically, politically, guys, was, gee, if you're getting this and you're a libertarian, you're going, yeah, I like that Cramer guy. Or if you're a liberal, you might go, geez, he's not as bad as I thought.
He's finally helping Democrats. That guy's finally helping Democrats.
Yeah.
It's the world's upside down. But actually, I think it speaks more to the populism of North Dakota. As you might imagine, gosh, our bankers are small, particularly our community bankers and our credit unions really needed this law. And gets sort of to your point, Rob, you know who can do this? Absent a law like this are the big corporations and the big banks. So once again, you're leaving out the entrepreneurs and the community banks. And I just think it's crazy. But thanks for asking the question, Chad. And I hope you didn't pass that text on to all your friends.
I only sent it to Rob because I thought it was so funny.
Yeah, it was. I thought it was very funny as well. Well, Senator, we're out of time. Thank you so much for your time today, as always.
Thanks, guys. Always fun.
Hi there, my name is James Wallner. I produce and host the podcast Dakota Spotlight, a true crime podcast that tackles historical and unsolved crimes in the upper Midwest. Follow along with me as we search for a missing girl, attempt to solve a 45-year-old murder, and much, much more. That's Dakota Spotlight Podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, or at inforum.com/podcasts.
All right, just finished up with Senator Cramer, and kind of an unusual. I mean, Chad, you and I are North Dakota guys, and that's on purpose. There's already a bazillion people talking about national and international politics. We don't need another podcast on that front. We focus on North Dakota stuff. That's our beat. That's what we both have expertise on that front. So it's a little unusual to talk with Senator Cramer about, what's going on internationally, but it's difficult to avoid it because we have this emergent situation in Israel. I mean, terrorists are cutting the heads off babies and posting the video online. It's barbaric and horrific. Yeah. And I think most normal people are united around, okay, we got whatever criticisms we may have of Israeli policy, we can't stand, on the side of that. So we have this going on. But meanwhile, our Congress can't do its business. And it's not just the House of Representatives. The Senate can't do anything either. I mean, they could pass all the bills they want. Nothing's going to become law unless they can get through the House of Representatives as well. So it's a terrible situation. And I don't know how you avoid talking about it.
So, Rob, I think one of the interesting things that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of foreign policy is when the leader of one of the major political parties in this country, right? We can talk about Democratic Socialists of America. We can talk about AOC. We can talk about these things on the left, and I denounce them, right? I mean, they're far on the left. They're out of the mainstream within the Democratic Party. The problem the Republicans have is the torchbearer of their party, Donald Trump, not only said Hezbollah is smart, but then went on to go after Netanyahu and talked about how he was asleep at the switch and was really, really critical of him, and at the same time is against helping Ukraine. I mean, I think that's a dangerous scenario looking forward. If this guy's got a shot at getting reelected president, and in these two fights, he's been against Israel and against Ukraine. I mean, and maybe that's too black and white, but it just seems like his messaging on this stuff is not where I think we should be.
At one point, it's I mean, if you're for Donald Trump because he sticks it to the Democrats' good, I mean, I guess okay, but is that the point? I mean, does that make good policy? Yeah. Is that facilitate what America needs to be on the world stage? I mean, we call the president of the United States the leader of the free world, and that's not. I mean, it's not a true thing. Obviously, other nations are sovereign and they have their own leaders and everything. That's not what I'm meaning. But I mean, we are influential. We are hugely influential on the international stage. And I worry that is being eroded because of dysfunction, massive, horrendous dysfunction in our politics. And while the left certainly has blood on their hands when it comes to that, when I said that Donald Trump was the epicenter of it in the United States right now, I don't think that's overstating the case at all. I mean, he really is. In terms of, I mean, we have to worry about an election that Donald Trump is involved in. We have to worry if that election is going to be accepted or if it's going to end in violence and bloodshed. That is a legitimate concern. We can no longer count on the peaceful transition of power in an election that Donald Trump's involved in, or frankly, down the road, an election that some of his followers may be involved in.
And you've got him as sort of the leader of the Republican Party. I mean, I think chances are he's going to be the nomination unless something crazy happens that I can't come up with. And then on the other hand, the one branch of government, the one piece of government that Republicans control, the House of Representatives. Somebody said to me this other day, and maybe this is the normal stuff, it's literally a majority in name only because they don't have a majority. I mean, if they can't elect Steve Scalise because he's not conservative enough. I mean, my goodness, at what point do we just say, hey, the Republicans being in charge here, they can't govern, right? They can't govern at a national level. Not saying that don't want to too broadly, but at this point in time, they don't have a Speaker of the House. And Donald Trump, with he's been indicted how many times as their torchbearer to win this nomination. I think it's time for some self-reflection. I think there are Republicans doing some self-reflection in Washington. I mean, I don't know that I've ever seen Kelly Armstrong as angry as I've seen him on some of his national interviews talking about the 8 folks that threw out Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah, he's fired up and he should be. And I think he's one who's doing a good job of trying. But still, I mean, at some point you have to break with Trumpism. I think you have to say, and you could even, I mean, when I say break with Trumpism, I mean, certainly if there are policies that he promoted that you like, then fine. That's not the problem. The problem is this person who is just a complete radical departure from American political norms, that is not going to operate within the guardrails of American politics, is not going to be respectful of our institutions and our processes. At some point you have to break with that. And I think also if America is going to be what I think we've aspired to be, imperfectly, I'll admit, but what we've aspired to be since the founding, which is sort of a beacon of hope to the rest of the world, right? A force for good in the world, to support the famous phrase, to support the aspirations of all free people, then we have to mean it in Ukraine, and we have to mean it in Israel. And we don't have the luxury of backing away. I don't want America to be world police. I think you can legitimately criticize our foreign policy, particularly during the George W. Bush era, of being a little too willing to go on foreign adventures. I understand that. And I'm on board with the criticism, certainly a lot more than I was back during those years. I think in retrospect, Iraq was a mistake. Right. But that is not justification. That is not an argument against Ukraine. That is not an argument against standing with Israel. The other day, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, stood around and was taking pictures with Code Pink at the Capitol. Now, if you lived through the 9/11 George W. Bush era, you know who Code Pink was. One of the most visible anti-war groups, very, very far left. One of the most visible anti-war groups in the country. And now suddenly you have a Republican congresswoman, supposedly, I mean, to use the nomenclature, a very conservative. It's the horseshoe theory personified. She's so far right, she's come full circle, and she's now, aligning herself with the far left. And I mean, at some point, it's like we got to cut the ends off the horseshoe and be governed by the people in the middle.
So one question that I wanted to get to with Senator Cramer is, what does this government shutdown, what does this chaos in the House mean for supporting Ukraine, right? I mean, it got pulled out of the CR. It seems like the vast majority of people in the House and the vast majority of people in the Senate want it to get done. But can anybody get elected as the Speaker of the House if they say they'll allow Ukraine funding to get to the floor. I mean, I don't understand the politics of Republicans to be anti-Ukraine. I mean, I think they're, obviously a conversation about scope and timeline and all that is really, really important. But it just feels like, in a battle between Russia and Ukraine, I think it's pretty clear what side we should be on here. So I worry about what this sort of dysfunction is going to mean. And again, like with McCarthy, what kind of concessions do you have to give up in order to be that speaker? And how do those things, come back to haunt you? One vote to remove the speaker. There's lots of stuff to consider here, and it's a 4-seat majority.
I want to revisit a point that I made back when the McCarthy vote went down, and I said, while certainly not excusing Republicans, I said that I was upset with Democrats for enabling Matt Gaetz, and you disagreed with me somewhat.
Yeah.
Do you still feel that way? Because I'm looking at it, and I feel even more confident in that argument, and the reason why is again, it's not about. I understand why Democrats don't want to help Kevin McCarthy and the very small, the slim Republican majority. I understand why, for normal political reasons, but these are not normal political times, and I worry about either side enabling the other side's extremes for short-term political gain. I think that if we keep doing that, we're gonna get more of the same.
So I think when we initially had this conversation, it was via text message, and I get your point completely, right? I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but where I disagree with, this isn't about Matt Gaetz. This was about Democrats not trusting Kevin McCarthy. And when I think about it, it's one of those situations where, when you think about the things that McCarthy did, should he have gone on the Sunday morning talk show and just went after the Democrats for the CR? I mean, that was just dumb politics. But I think where they were coming from is it's like having a spouse that cheats on you. And, this time it'll be different, I promise. And then does something bad again. Somebody pointed out to me that the moderate Dems also are the ones that received the most money against them during the last election from Kevin's super PAC, from McCarthy's super PAC. So there are some politics around this as well that makes it very, very difficult. And Democrats have their base as well. Kevin McCarthy is, okayed the Biden impeachment inquiry. I mean, there's a lot of stuff where if some of these Democrats broke off and voted for Kevin McCarthy, it's difficult. I mean, I understand your point, but maybe if they could have come together with a speaker who's a Republican that wasn't Kevin McCarthy, they could have gotten somewhere. But I think McCarthy burnt so many bridges.
Really, it illustrates how easy it would be if they could find a Republican who Democrats could trust. You could break this down real quick.
Right.
Because you get even a third or a fifth even of the Democratic caucus voting behind a Republican. They're going to be the speaker, and then we can
100 Republicans who say I don't trust somebody who the Democrats trust this much, and you lose that many votes on the other side, right? It's like a balloon.
And that's the partisanship I'm talking about. I think it has to be a Republican. They have the majority, but. I mean, at some point, maybe you have to go to the Democratic side and just say, listen, obstinate Republicans, you created this situation. We wouldn't need Democratic votes to do this if you'd get off your high horses. But now this is the position we're in. This country needs to be governed. We've got to respond to what's going on in the Middle East. We've got to continue to stand behind Ukraine. We've got to stave off the government shutdown. We've got a budget. We've got to do all the things the Congress needs to do. We can't, this partisanship cannot continue to lock us up like this.
Well, and if you're Kevin McCarthy, right? I mean, at the beginning of this whole government shutdown negotiation, he made the decision that he was going to try to get this done within his caucus and put together a really conservative plan to keep the government open. And nothing was good enough for these 8 people. Nothing was good enough.
I think that gets to Senator Cramer's point. I don't know that they're interested.
But and that's sort of my point that, where McCarthy ended, he could have started there, right? He could have said from the beginning, I'm going to work on a bipartisan sort of thing, but he's got his own politics that he has to deal with as well. I think if he would have known at the outset that those 8 people just wanted chaos and were never going to get it done, maybe he would have taken a different approach at the beginning of this to keep the government open. But I don't know. It's just dysfunction. I generally like when there's balance, where the two caucuses are similar in size. I've found that in North Dakota that works better for good policy. Clearly, it's not working in Washington when you can have a handful of people who and like this woman from South Carolina, Representative
Nancy Mace.
Yeah, I mean, she's supposed to be a moderate, and it seems to me all she cares about is being on TV.
Yeah.
I don't know what her goals
that's the incentives, and that's kind of the bugaboo here too. Is we need Americans to want to be governed again. And I don't know what the disconnect is there. I don't know if it's just because there's never really any consequence to all this political drama that at least none that the average American feels. Right? I mean, we feel some things, but not really, right? Because a lot of time when there's a problem, we just throw a bunch of money at it and add a bunch of money to the national debt. Nobody really thinks about it. You know, we've been able to do that for a long time. So I don't know, but there's nobody's feeling any pain. And so it's like, well, we may as well be entertained by all this. You know, at least it'll be funny. Why should I ever have to compromise anything? Because the fact that they don't ever get anything done never touches me. And maybe that's what it's going to take. I mean, I hate to say this because I don't want people to be hurt. I certainly don't want our country or our state to be hurt by it. But I'm worried if it's going to take some pain to wake people up and say this stuff matters.
Yeah, it is really, you saying that people want to be entertained or amused or whatever by our government. My God, I cannot think of anything less entertaining than what's going on in our country right now. And not in our country, our world, right? I mean, you turn on the news and you see this stuff going on in Gaza, and you talked about beheading of babies, and we can't universally condemn that. We can't universally take a side when it comes to that. I mean, that's scary stuff.
It really is. You know, I was thinking a lot when the Republicans held their presidential debate at the Reagan Library, which I visited, which, by the way, Republican or Democrat, is a wonderful museum to visit. There's a lot of very, very cool things, including the Air Force One that Reagan used that you can walk through. The full airplane is there. I remember thinking about Reagan in 1984, won 49 of 50 states, won 500 and whatever it was electoral votes. It's hard to imagine that happened, and really not. I mean, within our lifetimes, that happened. Right. Is kind of shocking where we've come to, and now Reagan kind of held up as this, and certainly by the left, as kind of this being this extreme conservative, whatever. Clearly, he wasn't. I don't think he was, and I think you could also say the same about a lot of past Democratic. Bill Clinton was a pragmatist. Whatever the rest of his faults, was a pragmatist. Oh. And gosh, I wish that we could be governed by people like that again, as opposed to what we have now. I am so tired of it. Like you, I'm not entertained. I don't think it's funny. I don't think it's cool that this stuff is happening.
I think one of the last times I was on, you and Ben and I were talking about, the two most likely presidential candidates being Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And you asked the question, something along the lines of, can Biden win, or I can't remember what it was, but my response to that was, no matter who the Democrat is, and no matter who the Republican is, this is a 52-48 race. We no longer can look past that little partisan label behind the person's name and say, listen, this person is just not qualified to be president of the United States. And that's a problem. I mean, Ronald Reagan did not win 49 states by just appealing to Republicans.
You're right.
Rest assured. I mean, we talk about Reagan Democrats in Michigan are still a thing. They're still a demographic that Democrats, strive to bring back into the fold moving forward. But I just don't, we think about Clinton, we think about the second Bush, even the first Bush. And I remember thinking about those folks as being like these, like George, the second Bush. I don't like some of the foreign policy stuff that he did. He was qualified to be president.
Sure.
Right. I mean, he's
been
qualified
governor,
to be president.
right.
People didn't like what Bill Clinton did with his extramarital stuff and with an intern or whatever.
And rightfully so. Rightfully so.
Right.
But he was
right.
he was qualified to be president. And I mean, right now I think Joe Biden was at one time in his life. I don't think he's vigorous enough for the job right now. But we're kind of in a position where it's going to be him or Donald Trump, who, I mean, at least Joe Biden is the ghost of a man who was once qualified for the job, as opposed to Donald Trump, who should not ever hold that job again, shouldn't frankly have held it the first time. And I will say I did not vote for Donald Trump because I made the calculation that although me refusing to vote for him may help a Democrat win, I made peace with that because I couldn't countenance him in the office. And when I tell people that, they look at me like it's something I should be ashamed of. That's the calculation you're supposed to make as an informed voter. Sometimes you do have to choose the lesser of two evils. And by the way, I didn't vote for the Democrat either, for Hillary Clinton. But yeah, I mean, that's where
So what did you do in 2020?
I left it blank.
And will you do that again in 2024
I guess. I mean, I guess we'll see the third party. I mean, I can't imagine that there's going to be a third party candidate that I'll like, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's just the way I do my vote. I understand people who would say, well, if you're not going to vote for the Republican, you should vote for the Democrat. I want to vote for somebody. I want to vote for somebody that I believe that they're going to do a good job.
Isn't your vote on the presidential race, I mean, essentially going back to Congress, I mean, saying the Democrats should have voted to save the country. I mean, shouldn't you be voting for somebody who's not Donald Trump then?
Well, maybe that's what I need to consider for 2024. That's not what I did in 2016 and 2020, but I mean, remember when I voted in 2020, January 6th hadn't happened yet.
Right.
I think things, although obviously I was very disillusioned with Trump, it wasn't as acute as things. January 6th clarified a lot of things. We'll put it that way.
Right. And post January 6th.
Yes.
And leading up to everything after
and everything that's been revealed about what Donald Trump tried to do in Georgia, for instance, what's been, revealed about him fraudulently inflating the value of his property and businesses, and which is frankly banking fraud. What's been revealed about him being held civilly liable for raping a woman. I mean, I don't see how you stick with Donald Trump at this point. And it boggles my mind when you ask, I mean, everything when we were interviewing Senator Cramer, everything that he said before I asked him about Donald Trump was great. I mean, all the stuff he was talking about, unserious people who don't want to govern, who only seem interested in chaos, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'd say, okay, but Donald Trump ushered in this era. He is in a lot of ways the avatar for that attitude. How do you continue supporting him? And then he's just. I've asked the senator, and I've asked the senator versions of that question over and over again, and I'm not going to get anywhere. I don't understand it. I don't think I will ever understand it.
I don't understand it either. And I think after the last time we had him on, we had this exact same conversation where it's like, okay, we're having this conversation, and then the second Trump came up, it's like, no, like everything he was describing before you asked him about Donald Trump was anti-Donald Trump. Without saying it, like the things that he was saying and everything he was saying, I mean, like made sense. I mean, it was like a real conversation, whatever. And then like the Trump stuff, it's just like there is, and I understand the politics. You can't be Kevin Cramer and start saying bad things about Donald Trump in this environment. With that being said, at some point, folks like Kevin Cramer have to start saying,
at some point, the well-being of the country has got to matter more than partisan political calculations. Which is my argument against Democrats, which again, I know it doesn't get you there, but you've also said that you understand it. I mean, I'm not, and that's not, and that's not me being partisan. Like I'm not blaming Democrats for what Republicans are doing for themselves. What I'm saying is at some point I want a coalition of the normies to come together and say, let's chop off the extremes and get back to boring debates about the tax code. So
no, I mean, again, I understand the point. I just it's living in fantasy land with sort of the history that Democrats have with Kevin McCarthy. Again, if it was somebody else who had like a clean slate, they might have been able to get it done.
And maybe that can happen. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? I mean, it's not likely to happen, but I mean, it would be really great if somebody like a Kelly Armstrong or a Dusty Johnson from South Dakota, who are, I think, pragmatists, could come out and build a coalition with moderate Republicans and Democrats to be speaker and to get the House moving again.
So let's start this campaign right here, Rob. Chad Oban and Rob Port endorse Kelly Armstrong to be Speaker of the United States House.
Yes.
This is a bipartisan coalition to move this country forward.
Yeah, let's get it done. And we can even say it's not about, necessarily that Kelly's just going to do everything that Democrats want to do. We've got to put patriotism above partisan politics and get something done. And Kelly, I think he'd be somebody Democrats can trust. He's a conservative. They're not going to like his policies or his agenda, but they can trust him.
Yeah, he's honest. There's no doubt about that. All right. So if Congressman Armstrong is listening, Rob and I are putting together a super PAC. We're going to make this happen.
Yeah, there we go. Well, I don't know about the super PAC thing, but
well, listen. I mean, I'm not going to think one more second about this as soon as you stop recording.
Yeah, well, that's that. Hey, we're out of time. We were going to talk about the special session coming up, where the court's denying the legislature more time, which I thought was interesting because 3 justices flip-flopped on that. In their original opinion, 3 of them were for giving them more time. Now they're saying no more time, but they do still have time because the court's mandate doesn't take effect until, I think it's like 28 days after. So I think they have until the 26th or something. I don't know what all the timeline is.
I think it's the 28th.
End of the month.
Is what I heard.
End of the month, basically.
I think, just like we have another week, I think, before they're going to actually go into session, so we can talk about this next Friday.
Yeah.
But the thing for people to watch is how narrow do they keep the scope of this thing? Do they focus just on OMB? I've heard some rumors that some leaders want some other things brought in. If you start bringing other things in, what does that mean?
Well, there's a group that wants school choice brought up, which I don't think is appropriate at all. I don't like the idea of making big policy changes during special sessions.
Especially if LaFleur said 3 to 5 days. If you think you're going to implement a voucher program in 3 to 5 days, you're crazy.
When House Majority Leader Mike LaFleur was on this show earlier this week, and he says he wants no delay. He doesn't even want a delayed bills committee. Now it's going to be up to legislative management. I think they're going to be meeting next week, but he doesn't want any delayed bills at all. It's just going to be the OMB budget taken apart and put in. So, but we'll talk more about that next week.
Well, Rob, with that being said, they can still amend those 14 to 16 bills with other things that people want, right?
Right. Well, yeah, but except they're also operating under the court just saying no more multi-issue bills. So, they're not going to be able to get too wild.
Yeah, but if you've got a PERS bill, for example, that has 4 legislators on it, and you want to add a rule that says the governor can remove somebody from the PERS board, that would be germane.
Yeah. And I think they should do that. Well, of course you don't, but I think that's acceptable. I think that's acceptable because it's germane to the reason of the special session. I mean, the whole reason the special session is happening is because of a food fight between the legislature, the governor, and the PERS board, with the legislature and the governor on one side and the PERS board on the other, elements of the PERS board on the other. I think reforming the PERS board is I think that's a legitimate addition.
But my point is, you don't have to allow delayed bills if that's something the majority wants to get done. They can do it through a different process. Let's not open this thing up to every crazy idea.
Well, I agree with that.
Rob, I read your blog. I know what some of the ideas are from legislators in terms of, Pritchard's ideas are not things that I want to see this special session.
Well, me neither. I don't want to see anything that's not related to the OMB budget and the PERS issue. That's it. That's what this special session's about. Anything else needs to wait for a regular session. Although we may have a second special session depending on what's going to happen with this redistricting lawsuit.
Oh, I hadn't even occurred. You know what? Let's just go permanent legislature in all the time.
Permanent legislature in all the time. Well, we're going to have to talk about that on another episode of Plain Talk, because this episode of Plain Talk is over. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk again. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.